Discover, engage, elevate. Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast.
The sound of Arabia.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Artifact, our podcast that discusses natural and cultural heritage. We have in the studio with us the cultural heritage content expert at the Royal Commission for AlUla, Mr. Adam Ford. Mr. Adam Ford, of course, is a renowned archaeologist working currently in AlUla, and he is passionate about communicating about archaeology and the service that archaeology does to communities.
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be on this podcast for AlUla FM. What got me into archaeology? I was 7 years old. I know this in a strange forensic detail, actually. It was, I think, the 21st of February, 1976 at about 11 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, so...
Primarily because my sister, who is 12 years older than me, studied archaeology, and I went on a training excavation while she was still at university. And I turned up, and I vividly remember seeing all these kind of archaeologists wearing big lumpy jumpers and lots of hair, because it was the 70s. And they were digging up human remains from an early Christian burial settlement in England. And I thought, this is amazing. You can do this as a job. And I scampered around, and I was up on the spoil heap on the dirt that had been pulled out of the archaeological excavation, and I found a human finger bone that had been missed. And I sat up there and I thought, this is fantastic, because I'm 7. So from that moment on, I just thought, I really want to know about what people of the past did or who they were and just tell their stories. And I didn't really think about any other career after that. It was always going to be archaeology. And then I thought, this is terrific.
What makes studying archaeology important, since that most of the things that you're studying or you're researching have happened such a long time ago? So why should we care about those things today?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think most archaeologists do think about what the validity of their subject is. So why bother? And I think over the years, I've come up with a number of different reasons why I think archaeology is valid in the modern world. I mean, one of them is purely aesthetic. People travel all over the world because I don't know if many people could actually put their finger on why they do it, but it makes them feel like they are part of something that's bigger than now, that has gravity to it. So you stand in front of the Parthenon or in the pyramids, or you're walking down an old medieval street, it hits you in the chest. So I think at that level, it's significant.
I thought you were going to say, well, some people just think it's a pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Like, you didn't even say that. You said aesthetic.
Yeah,
like,
I think the patina of age of ruins has an aesthetic quality which is very different to the modern world, but also is comfortable. You know, there's a thing about it, as I said, if you look at archaeological sites and ancient sites and historic landscapes, you've got family. It's almost like you've got a history behind you that gives you a certain comfort. Or sometimes it's literally just because the aesthetics, the human scale of things in the past, of landscapes and buildings and structures in the past, have a familiarity that is difficult to describe. So it does draw people. People are really interested in the visual qualities of ancient ruins and historic landscapes. So that's one level of value. But the other one is that pursuit of knowledge. It's that understanding that the past is a culmination of everything that humans have experienced up until now. And so the conservation of people's cultural heritage of its past is imperative for the well-being of people now. One of the best ways of ensuring conservation of archaeological sites and artifacts and people's cultural heritage is through education. If you tell the story of the past in a way that people appreciate it, they will be more likely to support you in conservation endeavors. Tradition is the foundation of language, of cuisine, of dress code, of religion, of spirituality, of so many of the codes and laws that govern and manage a society are based on the past. And they provide a sense of place, a sense of belonging. The past has an ability to inform that and elevate that level of significance. And I can tell you quite clearly how valuable that is, because cultural heritage is one of the first victims of warfare. Mm-hmm. So the destruction of people's cultural heritage, deliberately done, is codified by the UN as a crime against humanity, because it is a scar that will not heal. You cannot rebuild Palmyra. You cannot bring back cultural heritage that's been destroyed or spirited away and never to be seen again. So obviously it has value because it is targeted. And so the conservation of people's cultural heritage of its past is imperative for the well-being of people now.
And its conservation, obviously, as you said, it's priceless. It's not like conserving money. I mean, money could be replaced.
So conservation is imperative. And one of the best ways of ensuring conservation of archaeological sites and artifacts and people's cultural heritage is through education. If you tell the story of the past in a way that people appreciate it, they will be more likely to support you in conservation endeavors.
All right, when we're back, we'll be asking Adam Ford what his most memorable projects were.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
And now we're back with Adam Ford. When it comes to some of our archaeological projects, what were some of the most memorable projects you worked on?
Yeah, I have been fortunate to work on some really amazing archaeological projects, I've got to say. And I worked in Barbados when I was a youngster,
which is an island in the Caribbean.
Which is an island in the Caribbean. And it was a very, very nice archaeological excavation, I have to say, right next to the water. The first human settlers of those Caribbean islands coming from the Orinoco Basin in South America. And for me, it was so surprising that for some reason I'd assumed that these islands had always been inhabited, but they weren't. The people had transported on canoes from the South American north coast to these islands about 1,000 years ago. And we were finding kids' toys. It's that kind of family, run-of-the-mill, ordinary, normal artifact, which is probably the most potent in telling a story because it's just us. It's 1,000 years ago. It's intelligible to understand that it's just a family looking after their kid.
You can immediately relate.
You can immediately relate to it. And so some of the older archaeological sites, the ones that are further back, the 10,000, 15, 20, 30,000, 100,000-year-old sites that I've excavated over the years, they're just a bit more abstract. They're very interesting, but try and get someone to feel emotional about a stone tool that's 100,000 years ago is much more difficult than a child's toy that's 500 years or even 100 years old. So that was the first site that really got me to realize that what we were digging up was personal stuff, was personal stories, wasn't just an abstract.
That's so powerful because I remember we were having a side conversation about the difference between archaeology and history. You're really focused on the common person.
I want to know about the people on the ground, the average person who are never average. There's always something extraordinary about them. And so I've enjoyed over the years looking at how people face challenges that pretty much all of us face over the time. Can we afford this? What do we do with that? How do we do this? How do we extend a house? How do we put food on the table?
You were telling me that you prefer not to refer to history as history. You prefer to refer to history as the past.
Yeah, I might just say front up that I have very good friends who are historians. I see the difference between archaeology and historians is that the past, and I use the term the past very deliberately, because the past is totally objective. The past is everything, as I said, that's happened before. And archaeology pulls out of the ground objective data. It's bits of the past that have been left behind. Now, how we interpret those bits brings our subjectivity into it. Whereas history really is looking at all those bits and pieces that have been left behind. And the majority of the stuff that was ever used and left behind by people that don't exist anymore. And they have to create a story out of that.
When we get back, we're going to ask Adam what made him come to AlUla.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
And now we're back with Adam Ford. I'm trying to tie in your past with where you are now. What brought you to AlUla? From what I've read about you, Adam, you have worked in the Caribbean. You've worked in Mesopotamia. You've worked in Asia Minor. You've worked in Australia. You've worked in so many hot archaeological places around the globe. Why then AlUla? Like, is AlUla known in your sector or between your compatriots of archaeologists when you guys all huddle in Indiana Jones cave at night? Like, so what brought you here?
The thing that fascinates me about AlUla is that I did not know anything about it 14 months ago. And I widely read about Middle Eastern archaeology. I do keep up with it, even though I've spent a lot of my time working on sites in Australia. And then a colleague that I'd worked with in Turkey over 10 years ago, who works here for the Royal Commission for AlUla, he phoned me up, calls me up and says, do you feel like working out in AlUla? I said, well, where is AlUla to start off with? And he goes, Saudi Arabia. I said, sure. Is it warmer than here? Because I'm coming. But I did not know anything about it. As soon as I finished the dig that day, I went back, looked on the internet, started finding loads of imagery of Hegra, of course. Mm-hmm. And I thought, how come I don't know about this place? And so I flew out just over a year ago. And I was shown around by such engaged and excited and on-point people here that I'd met. And they showed me around Hegra and they showed me around Dedan and around the old town and the landscape. And I remember getting home and my wife said, so what was it like? I said, like nothing I have ever seen before in my life. It's one of the richest archaeological landscapes. And the fact that things are being discovered here that are not just rewriting the history books, but writing new chapters in the history books. And there's me talking about history. I am a big fan, I've got to say. But when I was studying at university, and I wished I'd been an archaeologist in the 1920s or the late 19th century, where these pioneers were discovering new civilizations. And I thought, well, everything's been discovered. I'm just going to be adding perhaps new information to established understandings of the human past. But here, they are discovering new civilizations. We are discovering surprising new elements, new chapters to the human story. And I never thought I would live to see something like that. So to be here is an absolute privilege. It's incredibly exciting. When the teams come back in September and they're working here until April, I can guarantee that we will find new, staggering information. And you can't say that about many other places in the world. So absolutely loving it. And I can't wait for the season to kick in again.
Lo and behold, the world is still filled with wonder.
Always full of wonder. But to have that as part of your career, for me, to have this opportunity to work out here is unexpected and very exciting.
When we're back, we're going to hear from Adam Ford what he's discovered that has forever changed the history books.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
And now we're back with Adam Ford. So Adam, you brought us to a very important question, which is you were talking about rewriting the history books. Have you or any of your teammates discovered anything that is changing the narrative of history or changing the history books here in AlUla?
Well, as I said, we oversee 10 to 15 archaeological projects each season, as I said, between September and April. There's normally about 150 archaeologists digging holes in the ground and conserving and surveying the landscape. So pretty much on a weekly basis, I'm talking to these guys and they say, oh, we've just got this date, or we've just recovered this, or we've just understood this. And I say, well, what does that mean? And you can see their face light up and they go, well, it means that it's 1,000 years earlier than we thought, or we found really early evidence of cultivation of a particular plant that we did not know either was cultivated here or didn't know it was going to be as early as it is. So I suppose a lot of the side subjects, like the paleo-environmental subjects or the ecological subjects that are being investigated by various teams from around the world, are as interesting as the site, digging up the big sites themselves, because Dedan is fantastic. It's an incredible archaeological site. It's a kingdom with Lihan as well. We've got this kind of complexity, which we've only just shedding a little bit of light on this society that up until very recently was unknown. It was heard of in texts in the past, but the more it's being interrogated, the more complex, the more nuanced and the more interesting and rich the Dadanite society is becoming.
Is there a specific example you can give us, like of something in archaeology may seem insignificant, but as an archaeologist, you realize that you've stumbled upon something very, very significant?
Obviously, we've got the statues that come from Dedan that gave us a real insight into something which I kind of knew, but really crystallized and amazed me all over again, was that what we're finding here in things like the Dadanite statues or in the rock inscriptions is that AlUla was at this crossroads and really clearly illustrates how the ancient world was much more connected than perhaps a lot of people believe. That's the interesting thing about landscapes that could be described as being marginal, because when you are in a desert environment or you're in a landscape such as we see a lot across the Arabian Peninsula, communities had to be connected, that they had to look outwards because they're on the edge. They're living on the edge. They're living on a precarious environment. And I think that creates an energy of adaptation and of creativity.
Practicality.
Yeah, but with the practicality comes that surge and energy of art and culture and that ability to accept external influence as well, because you can't be an isolated community because you rely so much on things coming from different locations, not necessarily just for survival, but to sustain and to embellish your life and to feed your need for artistic endeavor. And there's one thing you can always say about Arab culture is that the culture's love of art and love of creativity and love of writing and expression is constantly engaging for a modern society. And I think you can see that that has gone back many thousands of years. So AlUla is geologically in a situation where it has fresh water, which is important in a desert environment. But it was also the main crossing point north-south through the Hijaz, but also east-west.
Like the crossing point of crossing points, like the crossroads
It's
of
the
crossroads.
Yeah.
Because we hear that about Persia. We heard that about the Nile. We heard that about Crete, Cyprus, Constantinople.
I think what we have here is we have trade routes that come from a lot of different directions. So we have from the south, we have the incense coming from the Wadi Hadramaut and Oman and Yemen, bringing frankincense and myrrh, but also other very precious items like there's a shell that when you crush it up, it creates purple dye. Very rare, it was more valuable than gold, and that's why purple is always attributed to royalty, because it was so rare. So that came up from along that incense route. But then you've also got the spice route and the silk route that, as well as going north up through Mesopotamia and Assyria, also looped down south and came through AlUla on its way up through to Egypt and to the classical world. So we have this really interesting mix of trade. And of course, coming along with the trade are people coming from different worlds and coming from different societies and cultures. And not only do they bring on the back of their camels, but they also bring their art and their music and their language and their preference of food, as well as actual food crops themselves. And that's why you get this incredible richness of society in what on the surface appears quite a barren landscape, but in fact is one of those hot spots around the world where it is partly geology, but partly to do with by chance that this is where people met and they would stay around the water hole. Because if it just been a crossroads through the mountains, but there was no water, people would just kept going. But the fact that it was here, so people were stayed long enough to go, well, we add this to our curries, or we write like this, or this is the art, or these are the clothes. All that together creates a landscape that, from an archaeological point of view, makes it incredibly rich culturally. And to explore that, to explore the stories, is something that was going to be a lot more than my lifetime to do, that's for sure.
When we're back, we're going to be discussing some significant finds here in AlUla.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
Can you give us some exclusivity and insight on specific examples of things that you found that you would think that they're out of place? Have you found any finds like that?
Well, personally, it didn't occur to me that there would be evidence of Roman occupation or Roman activity in this region. And then I find that there's a Roman fort at Hegra that's been excavated over the last couple of years. So that was pretty surprising because it's mind-boggling to think how large the Roman influence and how broad it was across this landscape. So there's that. I think Hur, the site down near the airport, is remarkable because I had never heard of it before, and yet it's this huge early Islamic city, second only apparently to Mecca in the 7th and 8th century. And that the majority of it is surviving under this bleak plain and being excavated by the German archaeological team at the moment. And if you ever get to go there, you can see the streets. The walls are surviving up to shoulder high underneath the sand.
Wow.
And these beautiful artifacts. So you get this amazing lusterware ceramics with calligraphic script, the beautiful early Islamic calligraphy across it. And you look at that landscape now, it's as bleak as anything. We're coming from the airport. And then the Hajj route at that time, in those early years, in say the 8th and 9th century, the caravans were huge. So there's a story that it took 2 days for the caravan to pass under the gates of Damascus on its way out. We're talking 20,000 camels.
Wow.
Over 60,000 people. So camped out around Hur as they replenished their goods and fed their animals and so forth. I just think with all the color and the banners and the tents, it'd be like a music festival. And this huge, like be like Coachella or Glastonbury.
Yes.
And you don't get that when you just look at it, but when you start interrogating what you're looking at, what you're actually seeing, those artifacts in the ground, they're so colorful. So you've got to imagine that you can fall into a trap thinking, oh, well, you look at the old town, it's all brown.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's brown.
Yes. Or beige.
But you look at the wall paintings on the inside that are being conserved at the moment that are beautiful. And then you look at these incredible colored and decorated ceramics. And then you look at the tradition of carpet making, and you look at the decoration of tents, and you look at
the elaborate patterns.
You look at the beautiful calligraphic script of holy books and treatments. And all of a sudden you think, actually, this place would have been incredibly colorful.
Yes.
It would have been such a vibrant place. And that appreciation of art and decoration that goes beyond just the utilitarian or practical level, but going into an embellishment, all of a sudden gives you a whole new idea of what this valley would have been like in the past. And I think it would have been beautiful.
I imagine myself as like someone who was going on the caravan for the first time.
Well, that's right. I suppose part of the way of bringing the past to life is to tell stories. And so you can look at this landscape as you fly in and think, my goodness, people didn't just live here. They didn't just survive here on the edge of the desert. They thrived here, and they still thrive here. There is still such a strength of passion, which you can see day to day. I mean, there is a tradition, for instance, in AlUla that I heard about of poetry. Mm-hmm. The great poets in this region, and great artists and makers of materials and makers of baskets. And it's how we kind of romanticize the past, perhaps because the present is so familiar.
Stories that archaeology is explaining to people is that we're not so different from one another, and we're actually not so different from each other's ancestors. And while we're talking about the modern age, I know you have gone through a lot of training and you have developed materials to share your interest in archaeology and help people get into archaeology, lessen the friction between green entries, as you were referring to them in our conversation before we started recording the podcast, and being sophisticated enough or being experienced enough to work on archaeological sites that are really sensitive, and you really don't want to accidentally, even with good intentions, cause unintended damage. How are you using your role to empower the future generation of Saudi archaeologists?
One of the points you just touched on, which is really important, is that archaeological excavation is a one-use experiment. You can only do it once. Mm-hmm. You cannot repeat it, because as soon as you've dug it up, you've destroyed it. So as a new green archaeologist in the field, with that knowledge that whatever you're doing is destroying bits of the past, it's terrifying. because you have this huge responsibility. You think, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to damage things. It's not a very nice feeling.
It must give you lots of anxiety.
It does. And so what I would like to do is to design and facilitate a way of training young Saudis, or even older ones who've always wanted to try archaeology or become an archaeologist, to train on a site so that they can go from having no experience to, say, maybe 2 weeks later to be able to feel confident enough that they can join an archaeological project, a research project, such as Dedan or Hur or Hegra, and not be so terrified, have a certain amount of confidence that they can take instruction and they can do these simple tasks, and then watch them fly, watch them build their experience and become seasoned and good field archaeologists. Because my end game is to teach myself out of a job, because it's Saudi Arabia's cultural heritage. It's not my cultural heritage, even though I love it very much. And it is best to have Saudi Arabian archaeologists digging Saudi sites.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we're back, we're going to ask Adam about the intentional desecration of heritage and why it's so important to protect our artifacts.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
And now we're back with Adam Ford. We were talking about the value of these sites, right? And like you explained to me before, doing archaeology, if you make a minor mistake as an archaeologist working on sensitive areas, you can't really just put a Band-Aid on it. You can't really put stitches on it, which brings us to the intentional desecration of our natural and cultural heritage. Like we saw 2 incidents in Italy recently, and I'm sure that has your blood boiling. Do you know what I'm saying? We had 2, I would say, foolish individuals. They carved meaningless inscriptions on the Colosseum. And I think 90% of our listeners understand why that's terrible. But could you explain to us why are they so important to preserve?
So I maybe put that in perspective. And when I'm talking about cultural heritage being damaged in wartime, I think our emphasis has always got to be on the living and on the people who are affected by war. And then we look at the cultural heritage.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, the thing about archaeological landscapes and archaeological sites is that they are very fragile. As I said, if you damage them or remove them, they're not going to grow back. The Buddhas at Bamiyan in Afghanistan were destroyed by rocket fire. They're not going to be rebuilt.
Yes.
And it's one of the reasons why archaeologists dig very slowly. It's not just because they've got nothing else better to do, although most of us haven't. It's the fact that we've got to do it carefully because we acknowledge that we're destroying it. Therefore, we've got to get every bit of information out of it as we can. Now, those guys who carved their name in the Colosseum, okay, it's not the end of the world because the Colosseum's massive and it will withstand a little bit of that.
And it also has ancient graffiti on it.
But it is something that you need to deter because archaeological landscapes and sites aren't just ours. They aren't just for this generation. They're for future generations. So we have to conserve what we see as the most important or the most fragile or the rarest or the sites that mean the most to people now, but what we consider will be important going forward into the future. So we can't do this alone. We can't just say it's archaeologists and conservators' job to protect these archaeological sites and protect the elements of the physical elements of the past. It is everyone's responsibility. So we do have an issue. For instance, at the moment we have an issue with graffiti being applied to archaeological sites and surfaces of archaeological features.
Here in AlUla, or do you mean globally, internationally?
Globally and internationally, but we have it here in AlUla and elsewhere in Saudi Arabia, but really it's something that happens all over the world. Now, someone might not think much of it. They might go there with a spray can and spray their name on one of the tombs, for instance, at Hegra. And they probably think, oh, well, it's only on the surface. It's not going to be a problem. I'm not hacking down a column or anything like that. But the trouble is with the landscape here is that the sandstone is very friable. It's very delicate and it's also very porous. So that spray paint, to remove it, because it's unsightly and it's not something that you want on these sites, actually damages the site. It's very difficult to remove that graffiti without causing damage. And we're actually investigating cutting edge technology using lasers to actually remove this material. But the most ideal thing is to not graffiti the site, is to explain to people in a way that these sites are valuable. They're not just valuable to us as archaeologists or to scientists who study the past, but they are valuable to everyone. They are the community's commonwealth. And it is the responsibility of everyone to be curators and conservers of their past. So we're launching a campaign that's going to help awareness of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate around archaeological sites and around heritage landscapes. And I don't get angry about it. People don't know. So if they don't know that it's wrong to do that, then we can inform. And there's no point in just saying, don't do it because we say so and because we think it's important. We need to say, it'd be great if you could help us to change this attitude and this behavior around the sites, because it'll mean that your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids will be able to enjoy it as much as you. And if you enjoy it, then can you give us a hand, help us to preserve and save these delicate elements of the landscape and for the benefit of everyone, really. So that's something that I'm also very passionate about. And I think education and bringing people along and giving them advocacy to be the guardians of their own landscape and of their own heritage is as important as digging it up and understanding what's under the ground.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we're back, we're going to ask Adam what his favorite archaeological sites are in AlUla.
Artifact with Joshua on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.
All right, just one last thing. And I want you to 100% use your archaeologist goggles here, your very modern tools when thinking about this question. Your favorite, most exciting archaeological site in AlUla is
Khor by a long stretch.
Oh, okay, good.
Because it's flown under the radar a bit, it's not an activated site, so it's actually not currently accessible to the general public, but it will be. But it is this extraordinary landscape, this incredible archaeological site coming out of what seems to be a very unpromising landscape. I think it was such an important part of the Syrian Hajj route for over 600 years. It's so redolent of what I always imagined that early Islamic Arabia to be. It's so intelligible because you can see the streets and you can see how the buildings are constructed. It's pretty well preserved under the ground. But we've only just got this tantalizing look at it. And I believe that it's going to be one of the great jewels in the crown of AlUla in years to come.
That brings me to my last question. What is the future? It's not oxymoron. I'm sure you heard this question all the time, but just for our listeners, what is the future of archaeology in Saudi Arabia?
I think it's one of the most promising and vibrant opportunities. And the young people of this country are so energized. They are so excited about potentials of different subjects, archaeology being one of them. But the fact that there's been great work done over the last 20 or so years by King Saud University and others, for instance, but there is so much more to come. And to open a blank book and start filling it with the stories of this remarkable landscape's past is going to be something to see, I tell you that.
Well, we hope to delight our listeners with your updates. Enjoyable is that we know that it comes with its challenges, and we want to hear about those challenges. We want to hear about how we can utilize the challenges that you're facing here in AlUla for applications of this industry in the future. All right, everybody, you heard it here. That was Adam Ford, Cultural Heritage Content Expert at the Royal Commission for AlUla. Thank you, Adam.
Pleasure, and that's been lovely to have a chat.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Artifact.
Thanks.
Subscribe for more great content right here on AlUla FM podcast. The sound of Arabia.